Jane Hartley clutched the small bouquet of daisies so tightly that the stems almost broke between her fingers. St. Mary's Church, modest and damp, smelled of mold and melted wax. Only 3 witnesses occupied the worn wooden pews: Mrs. Pemberton, her landlady, who sniffled loudly into a stained handkerchief; Mr. Davison, the baker who occasionally offered her stale bread; and an older woman Jane didn't recognize, dressed in a grey cloak that hid her face. The vicar, an elderly man with a trembling voice, began the ceremony with evident haste. He wished to finish quickly and return to the comfort of his hearth. Jane didn't blame him. It was a frigid November afternoon, and the church offered no refuge from the cold that seeped through the ancient stones. Beside her, Michael Ashford remained strangely still. His fingers, when they enveloped hers during the vows, were warm despite the temperature. Jane discreetly studied his profile. He was a reserved man, with angular features and dark eyes that seemed to carry secrets. The black suit he wore, though clean and well-maintained, showed signs of age in the mended seams, and the fabric lightly faded at the elbows. Jane had met him just 6 weeks prior, when he had appeared at her sewing workshop looking for someone to mend his son's clothes. She worked in a small rented room near the London docks, where the smell of fish and salt permeated everything. Her clients were mainly wives of sailors and modest tradesmen. Michael didn't seem to belong to any of these categories. He had returned 3 times that first month, always with an item to mend, always watching her work with an intensity that unsettled her. On the 4th visit, he had made his proposal. "I need a mother for my son," he had said without preamble, "and a wife. I cannot offer luxuries, but I can offer security and respect. Will you consider me?" Jane should have refused. She should have found the proposal outrageous, even insulting. But there was something in his voice, in the way he mentioned his son, that had touched something deep within her heart. At 26, she knew her prospects for marriage were minimal. She was too poor to attract suitors of better standing, and too clever to accept the drunkards and violent men who occasionally courted her. Besides, there was the boy. Christopher was only 5, with brown curls and large, lost-looking eyes. When Michael had brought him to meet her, the child had clung to his father's leg with such desperation that Jane had felt her heart ache. He needed love, maternal care. And Jane, an orphan since she was 12, perfectly understood what it was to grow up without such solace. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the vicar announced, closing his book with a soft thud. Michael turned to her. For a moment Jane thought he would kiss her, but he merely touched her cheek with unexpected tenderness. "Thank you," he murmured, so low that only she could hear, "for giving me this chance." There was gratitude in his voice, but also something more, relief perhaps, or fear. The carriage awaiting them outside surprised Jane. Though it was neither new nor ostentatious, it was in far better condition than she had expected. The coachman, a stout, middle-aged man, nodded briefly at Michael with a familiarity that suggested a long association. "My lady," the man said, helping her ascend. There was genuine respect in his voice, not the indifference that servants usually reserved for people of her class. Michael's apartment was in Bloomsbury, a respectable, if not fashionable, neighborhood. The red brick building was solid and well-maintained. Jane had noticed during her previous visits that the neighbors seemed decent folk. A retired solicitor, a naval captain's widow, a professor of classical languages. Christopher awaited them with the governess, Mrs. Dawson, a plump woman with rosy cheeks who embraced Jane immediately. "Welcome home, dear. Little Christopher is eager to see you." The boy ran to Jane, hugging her skirts. "Will you stay now?" he asked, looking up with hope so pure that Jane felt tears prick her eyes. "Yes," she promised, kneeling to be at his level. "Now I stay." The apartment was larger than Jane had expected. 3 bedrooms, a comfortable sitting room, a spacious kitchen. The furniture was simple but of good quality, the kind that would last generations. Dark green velvet curtains framed the windows, and there were books everywhere stacked on shelves and tables. Jane didn't know many poor men who owned so many books. Mrs. Dawson had prepared a modest but delicious supper, roast chicken, potatoes, and vegetables. Christopher chattered throughout the meal, recounting stories of his lessons and games, clearly trying to impress his new mother. Michael remained quiet, watching them with an expression Jane couldn't quite decipher. When Mrs. Dawson took Christopher to bed, Michael guided Jane to the sitting room. He poured her a glass of red wine, an unexpected luxury. "I need to attend to some matters in the study," he said, avoiding her gaze. "Financial documents that require review. I won't be long. Make yourself at home. This is your house now." He disappeared into one of the rooms, closing the door softly. Jane was left alone, listening to the grandfather clock tick away the time. Something didn't add up. A man who claimed to be almost ruined didn't have fine wine, didn't have a full-time governess, didn't have a private carriage. Curiosity, that dangerous companion her mother had always warned her against, stirred. Jane walked down the corridor, noticing details she had overlooked before. The door frames were of carved oak. The wallpaper, though discreet, was of superior quality. And there was an additional door she hadn't noticed earlier, partially hidden behind a heavy curtain. Her heart quickened as she approached. The door was unlocked. It opened silently to reveal a small but exquisitely tidy study. A mahogany desk occupied the center, covered with papers carefully organized in stacks. Jane knew she shouldn't look. It was a breach of trust, a terrible start to a marriage. But her hands were already reaching for the first document, and her eyes were already beginning to read. It took only a moment for her world to shatter and rebuild itself in an entirely new configuration. The papers were property deeds, share certificates, legal documents marked with impressive seals. Names of companies that even she, with her limited education, recognized: shipping lines, banks, textile manufacturers, and all listed the same partial or full owner, Michael Ashford. Not just a few properties, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Jane's hands trembled as she leafed through page after page. There were also correspondences, letters from solicitors and bankers, and warnings, several warnings about threats, extortion attempts, unspecified dangers that advised him to remain discreet, to keep his whereabouts secret. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Jane whirled around so quickly she nearly dropped the papers. Michael was leaning against the doorframe, watching her with a tormented expression. There was no anger on his face, only a painful resignation. Jane couldn't form words. Her husband, the ruined widower she had agreed to help out of compassion, was apparently one of the wealthiest men in England. The silence between them grew like a living creature, filling every corner of the small study. Jane clutched the documents to her chest, feeling the expensive paper mark her skin through her wedding dress. Her wedding dress, worn only a few hours ago. It already seemed to belong to another life, another woman, someone naive enough to believe she knew the man with whom she had exchanged vows. Michael took a step towards her, and Jane instinctively recoiled, bumping against the desk. His expression twisted, as if she had physically struck him. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice hoarse. "I would never harm you. Never." "How can I know what you would do?" The words came out sharper than Jane intended. "I don't even know who you are." Michael ran a hand through his hair, disheveling the dark strands. In the faint candlelight, Jane noticed for the first time the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the permanent tension in his shoulders. He looked like a man carrying an invisible burden for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to stand straight. "My name is Michael Ashford," he began, each word measured and deliberate. "That, at least, is true. I was born in Yorkshire, the son of a wool merchant who built a small empire through hard work and astute investments. I inherited his businesses at 23, when he died of a fever. Over the next 10 years, I transformed that small empire into something considerable." Jane watched him carefully. There was pride in his voice when he spoke of his businesses, but also something darker. Regret, perhaps. "I married Catherine Blackwell at 25, the daughter of an impoverished baron. It was a marriage of convenience initially, but we grew. Fond of each other, she gave me Christopher." His voice faltered as he mentioned his son. 3 years ago, Catherine fell ill. Doctors couldn't determine what. She wasted away before my eyes, and all the gold in England couldn't save her. Jane felt her anger soften slightly. There was genuine pain in his every word, the kind of suffering that couldn't be faked. After her death, things changed. Incidents began to occur. A fire at one of my warehouses that nearly killed a dozen workers, documents stolen from my study, attempts to blackmail me with false accusations of dishonest business practices. He walked to the window, looking down at the dark street below. Then there were more direct attempts, a shot that missed my head by inches as I walked home, poison in my wine that my butler discovered by chance. Jane swallowed hard. Who would do such things? I have enemies. Michael turned to face her, and there was something fierce in his eyes now. When one accumulates significant wealth, one creates enemies without even trying. Competitors who lose contracts, partners who feel cheated, people who simply covet what you possess. My solicitors have identified at least half a dozen possible suspects, but without concrete proof. So you went into hiding, Jane said slowly, understanding beginning to form in her mind. You pretended to be poor, moved to an ordinary apartment, to protect Christopher. Michael's voice trembled. He is all that remains of Catherine. I cannot lose him. I realized that as long as I lived openly as Michael Ashford, the industrial magnate, my son would always be a target. But as Michael Ashford, the impoverished widower, living discreetly in Bloomsbury. He paused. No one would look twice. Jane placed the documents back on the desk, her hands now steadier. Her mind rapidly processed the information, fitting together pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed. The governess, the coachman, they know who you really are. Dawson and Fletcher have served my family for decades. I trust them with my life, with Christopher's life. Michael approached again, more cautiously this time. There are also guards, discreet ones, watching the house constantly. You never see them, but they are there. The revelation sent a chill down Jane's spine. How many times had she walked to this apartment during their courtship, unaware of invisible eyes tracking her every move? And me? Her voice was barely more than a whisper. Where do I fit into this elaborate arrangement? Michael stopped a few paces from her. I needed a wife. Christopher needed a mother, but I couldn't court women from the social circles I used to frequent. Any of them would have had expectations, connections, families that would ask questions. I needed someone without ties to my previous world, someone who wouldn't miss wealth because she never had it, Jane finished, bitterness tinging her words. Someone desperate enough for security that she would accept a stranger without too many questions. No. Michael closed the distance between them in 2 swift strides, taking her hands before she could pull back. His fingers were warm, firm, and Jane hated how his touch still sent heat through her veins. It wasn't out of desperation that I chose you, it was for character. Jane tried to pull her hands away, but he held them gently. I watched you for weeks before I introduced myself. I saw how you treated your clients, even the most difficult ones, with patience and dignity. I saw how you saved every penny, but always left food for the stray cats near your workshop. I saw how you mended clothes for poor children for free, working late into the night by candlelight. He released one of her hands to cup her face, and Jane found herself unable to pull away. I saw genuine kindness, Jane. Integrity. Exactly the kind of person I wanted raising my son. Exactly the kind of woman who could love me for who I am, not for what I possess. But you deceived me, she protested, though her voice had lost some of its strength. You built this entire charade. Yes. He didn't deny it, didn't try to justify. And if I could go back, I would still do it, because keeping you ignorant was keeping you safe. If my enemies found out about you, about the marriage... He closed his eyes briefly. It would have put a target on your back. Jane weighed his words. Part of her wanted to scream, to demand that he take her away immediately, that he annul the marriage and let her return to her simple but honest life. But another part, the part that had watched Christopher during supper, that had seen the vulnerability in Michael's eyes when he spoke of his late wife, hesitated. So the marriage, she said slowly, understanding beginning to form in her mind, was as much to protect me as it was to acquire a mother for Christopher. As my wife, you have my full protection. My resources, my safety, everything I possess now also protects you. Michael stepped back slightly, giving her space. I know I have no right to ask for your trust. I violated it before I even earned it, but I ask for your consideration. Stay. Get to know Christopher. Get to know me, the real man, not the facade I showed you. And if I refuse? Jane asked, though she already knew his answer. If I demand an annulment, then I will arrange for one. There was no hesitation in his voice. I guaranteed you safety and respect. That includes respecting your choice to leave. But before you decide... He took a small strongbox from a shelf, opening it to reveal legal documents. These are papers my solicitors have prepared. If you choose to stay, if you choose to try and build this marriage with me, you will have complete access to everything. Bank accounts, properties, business decisions. You won't have total control, but you will not be kept in ignorance again. Jane looked at the documents, then at the man before her. Michael Ashford, impoverished widower. Michael Ashford, magnate in disguise. Which was real? Or were both facets of the same complex person? I need time, she finally said, to process this, to think. You have all the time you need. Michael closed the strongbox. Your room is the second on the left down the corridor. I've locked the connecting door to mine. I won't disturb you. When you're ready to talk again, I'll be available. He walked past her towards the door, then stopped. Jane, for what it's worth, I apologize. Not for protecting my son in the only way I knew how, but for not trusting you enough from the beginning. You deserved the truth. Then he was gone, leaving Jane alone in the study, surrounded by evidence of a life she had never imagined. She sank into the chair behind the desk, her legs suddenly unable to support her. She had married in the morning. She had discovered her husband was one of England's wealthiest men by night. And now, in the silent hours before dawn, she needed to decide whether to stay or flee. From the corridor she heard soft sounds. Christopher, having a nightmare perhaps, and Mrs. Dawson's gentle voice soothing him. The boy who had called her mother with such hope. The boy who had lost one mother and now risked losing another. Jane closed her eyes, breathing deeply. The decision, she realized, had already been made the moment she promised Christopher she would stay. Now it only remained to discover if she could find true love amidst the wreckage of a marriage built on secrets. The grey morning light filtered through the curtains when Jane finally emerged from her room. She had spent a sleepless night, sitting by the window watching the streets of Bloomsbury gradually come to life. Delivery carts, street vendors, maids hurrying about their morning duties. A common, ordinary world, now so distant from the reality in which she found herself. Her eyes stung with tiredness, but her mind was strangely clear. During those silent hours, she had processed Michael's every word, every revelation, every implication. And she had come to a conclusion that surprised even herself. She would stay, at least for now. Mrs. Dawson was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The governess looked up as Jane entered, and something in her expression, a mixture of concern and understanding, suggested she knew exactly what had transpired the previous night. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashford," she said, with deliberate emphasis on Jane's new title. "Tea? Please." Jane sat at the small kitchen table, watching the governess's competent hands prepare the drink. "How long have you known the truth, Mrs. Dawson?" The older woman didn't feign misunderstanding. "I've served the Ashford family since Master Michael was a boy of 10. I knew his mother, God rest her soul, and his father before hard work took him too soon. I saw all they built, all that young master inherited and multiplied." She placed the teacup before Jane, then sat down with her own drink, a gesture of familiarity that surprised her. But Jane was beginning to realize that this house operated under different rules than those she knew. "I also saw when things began to deteriorate after Mrs. Catherine's death," Mrs. Dawson continued, her voice heavy with sadness. "The threats, the dangers. The master tried to keep me away, to protect me, but I refused to abandon him, especially with little Christopher needing care." "Aren't you afraid," Jane asked, "of being here, knowing there's danger?" "Fear?" The governess considered the question. "I suppose so at times, but loyalty and love overcome fear, my dear. That man down the hall isn't just my employer. He's a boy I comforted through nightmares, a young man I helped through grieving his mother, a father I held when he wept over his wife's body." She took a sip of tea. I won't abandon him now." Jane absorbed her words, feeling something soften in her chest. There was such genuine loyalty in Mrs. Dawson's voice, such real affection. Michael inspired such devotion in his servants. That said something about his character, didn't it? "He's a good man," the governess added softly, as if reading Jane's thoughts. "He makes mistakes, as we all do, but his heart is true, and he is utterly dedicated to protecting those he loves." Before Jane could reply, small footsteps echoed in the corridor. Christopher appeared at the kitchen doorway, still in his nightshirt, brown hair disheveled from sleep. His eyes lit up when he saw Jane. "You're still here," he exclaimed, running to hug her with such force that he almost knocked her off her chair. "I thought maybe you'd gone away like Mama." Jane's heart ached painfully. She wrapped her arms around the boy, feeling him tremble slightly. "I haven't gone anywhere, darling. I promised I'd stay, remember?" Christopher buried his face in her shoulder. "Papa said Mama would stay too, but she got sick, and then she wasn't here anymore. He said she went to heaven, but I don't understand why she would go without me." Jane looked at Mrs. Dawson over the child's head, seeing her own emotions reflected in the governess's moist eyes. This was the reality Michael faced daily. A son traumatized by loss, living in constant fear of losing someone else. "Your mama didn't want to go," Jane said gently, pulling him back just enough to look into his eyes. "But sometimes people get so sick that their bodies can't keep going, no matter how much their hearts wish to stay. I'm sure she would have stayed if she could. You won't get sick too?" The question was so vulnerable, so full of childish fear, that Jane felt tears threaten. "I'll do everything I can to stay healthy and here with you," she promised. "Now, how about we get properly dressed for breakfast? Then we can talk about what we'll do today." Christopher nodded enthusiastically, his mercurial mood returning to joy. Mrs. Dawson took him off to get dressed, leaving Jane alone with her thoughts once more. Michael hadn't appeared. Jane didn't know whether to feel relieved or disappointed. Part of her wished to confront him in daylight, when everything seemed less surreal. Another part welcomed the postponement, more time to organize her confused feelings. She returned to her room to change, choosing one of her simplest dresses, dark blue and practical. As she put it on, she noticed for the first time details she had overlooked the night before. The wardrobe was solid and spacious, much larger than she needed for her few possessions. The bed, though modest in appearance, had sheets of superior quality. And there were fresh flowers in a vase by the window, daisies like the ones she had carried at the wedding. Michael had thought of small comforts, even while maintaining the facade of simplicity. The gesture touched her more than she expected. When she descended to the sitting room, she found Christopher already dressed and seated by the fireplace, looking at a picture book. The boy jumped up at the sight of her. "Look, this book has pictures of ships. Papa said maybe we can go see real ships one day. Would you like to come with us?" "Very much," Jane replied, sitting beside him. "I used to see ships arrive at the docks when I worked there. It always fascinated me to think of all the distant places they came from." They spent the next hour examining the book together, Christopher asking endless questions about oceans and foreign countries, which Jane answered as best she could. The child was clearly intelligent, curious, and starved for maternal attention. Each time she praised him or laughed at one of his observations, his eyes sparkled with pure delight. It was thus that Michael found them when he finally emerged from his room. Jane felt him before she saw him, a shift in the atmosphere that made her skin tingle. She looked up and found him standing in the doorway, watching them with an expression so intense that she had to look away. He wore simple clothes, trousers and a white shirt, but there was something different about him this morning. A tension in his shoulders, lines of fatigue around his eyes that suggested he had slept as little as she had. "Papa!" Christopher ran to hug his father. "We were looking at the ship book. Jane said she saw real ships." "Did you really?" Michael lifted his son, and Jane saw genuine tenderness on his face. Whatever his flaws, his love for Christopher was unquestionable. "Then we'll have to take you to see more." He gently set Christopher down. "Why don't you go ask Mrs. Dawson for a biscuit? I need to talk to Jane for a moment." The boy dashed off, leaving them alone. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Jane was the first to break it. "I've decided to stay," she said directly, "at least for now. For Christopher, who clearly needs stability, and because—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I believe your intentions were good, even if your methods were questionable." Michael exhaled a breath that seemed to carry the weight of weeks. "Thank you. I don't deserve your understanding, but I am grateful for it. But," Jane continued, her voice firm, "I need complete honesty from now on. No more secrets, no more half-truths. If there will be danger, I need to know. If there are decisions to be made, I need to be involved. I will not be kept in ignorance again." "I agree completely." Michael approached, stopping at a respectful distance. "My solicitors will come this afternoon. I will prepare all the documents I mentioned. You will have full access to everything." Jane nodded, then asked what had been troubling her since the previous night. "The guards you mentioned. How many are there?" "4 working in shifts, 2 during the day, 2 at night. They remain discreet, but they are always watching." He gestured vaguely towards the window. "Fletcher, my coachman, is also trained in protection, and Dawson, though she would never admit it, knows how to use a knife better than most men." The image of the kind Mrs. Dawson armed with a knife would have been comical if it weren't so unsettling. "And inside the house are there weapons?" "Yes, but locked away, especially with Christopher nearby." Michael ran a hand through his hair, that gesture of frustration Jane was beginning to recognize. "I know this isn't the marriage you imagined. It isn't the marriage I wished to offer you. But I swear I will do everything in my power to keep you safe and eventually, I hope, happy." Jane studied him in the morning light. She saw him clearly now, without the illusions of the previous night. A man haunted by loss, desperate to protect what remained, willing to lie and deceive but also capable of genuine vulnerability and regret. "Happiness is something we will build together, or not at all," she said finally, "but security, that I can accept, for Christopher, if not for myself. Then we'll start there." Michael extended his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, Jane accepted it. Their fingers intertwined, and she felt again that unexpected warmth, that connection that had existed even when she thought he was just a poor widower. Perhaps, Jane thought, as she allowed him to hold her hand for another moment, there was hope for this unlikely marriage after all. Not the fairy tale love story that young girls dreamed of, but something more complex, built on truth and choice instead of illusion and necessity. Christopher came running back, biscuit in hand, oblivious to the tension that still lingered between the adults. "Can I show Jane my toys now?" "Of course," Michael and Jane answered simultaneously, then exchanged surprised glances. A small smile curved his lips, and Jane felt herself respond with one of her own, hesitant but genuine. It would be a start. The afternoon unfolded with a surreal normality. Jane found herself settling into the role of mother with a surprising ease. Christopher was a charming child when he wasn't paralyzed by the fear of abandonment. They played with lead soldiers on the sitting room rug, read stories of maritime adventures, and Jane even initiated him into word games her own mother had taught her so long ago. Michael kept his distance, occasionally observing from his study door, but not interfering. Jane felt his gaze upon her at unexpected moments, a constant weight that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. There was something comforting about being observed with such intensity, even if the reason behind it still troubled her. Mrs. Dawson prepared a substantial luncheon, and for the first time since the wedding, the 3 sat together at the table as a family. Christopher chattered about everything and nothing, filling the uncomfortable silences between the adults with his childish innocence. Jane noticed how Michael interacted with his son, patient and attentive, answering every question, no matter how absurd, with genuine seriousness. "Why is the sky blue, Papa?" "Sunlight contains all colors, but the air scatters blue light more than the others, so that's what we see." "And why is grass green?" "Because it contains something called chlorophyll, which helps plants turn sunlight into food." Jane observed this exchange with growing fascination. Michael Ashford, industrial magnate, patiently answering the philosophical questions of a 5-year-old as if they were the most important matters in the world. There was an incongruity between the man who commanded commercial empires and the gentle father before her that was simultaneously disquieting and appealing. After luncheon, Mrs. Dawson took Christopher for his daily nap, leaving Jane and Michael alone in the sitting room. The silence that followed was heavy with unresolved tension. "You're good with him," Jane said finally, breaking the silence. "With Christopher. It's clear you love him deeply." Michael turned from the window where he had been watching the street. "He is all I have left of Catherine. Every one of his smiles, every gesture reminds me of her. Sometimes it's painful, but I would never let that pain push me away from him." "What was she like?" Jane asked, surprised by her own curiosity. "Catherine." A distant expression crossed Michael's face. He walked to the fireplace, where a small portrait rested on the mantel. Jane hadn't noticed it before, or perhaps she simply hadn't paid attention. He picked it up, studying the image for a long moment before handing it to Jane. The woman in the portrait was beautiful, in a delicate way, with blonde hair arranged in elaborate curls and light eyes that seemed kind even through the brush strokes of paint. There was something fragile about her, an ethereal quality that made Jane understand why her death by illness was not entirely surprising. "She was sweet," Michael said softly, "and incredibly patient. She grew up in difficult circumstances. Her family had lost almost everything before she met me, but she was never bitter or resentful. She accepted our arranged marriage with grace, and in time we grew to truly care for one another." Jane detected something in his voice that gave her pause. "But you didn't love her," she said slowly. "Not in the way one reads about in novels." Michael met her gaze, and there was raw honesty in his eyes. "No, not in that way. We had affection, respect, partnership, but ardent passion, consuming love? No. And I believe she felt the same. We were comfortable companions who built a functional life together. The admission should have made Jane sad, but instead it brought a strange relief. There was an honesty to it, a lack of romanticizing the past that made Michael more human, more real. "And now?" Jane handed him back the portrait. "What do you expect from this marriage?" "Honestly?" Michael carefully replaced the portrait on the mantel. "I don't know. When I planned this, I was only thinking of security, of giving Christopher stability. But last night, when you were in that study holding evidence of all my lies, and yet this morning you chose to stay." He paused, seemingly searching for words. "I began to hope that perhaps we could build something real." The sound of carriages pulling up outside interrupted their conversation. Michael checked his pocket watch. "My lawyers have arrived. I promised full transparency, and we will begin now." The two men Mrs. Dawson ushered into the room were studies in contrast. The first was elderly, perhaps 70, with white hair and gold-rimmed spectacles. He was impeccably dressed in black, every button perfectly aligned. The second was young, no more than 30, with sharp features and eyes that quickly assessed everything. "Mr. Pemberton, Mr. Walsh," Michael greeted them formally. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Jane Ashford." Their reaction was telling. Mr. Pemberton bowed deeply, genuine respect in his gesture. Mr. Walsh, after a moment of poorly concealed surprise, followed suit, though his eyes remained calculating. "Madam Ashford," Mr. Pemberton said warmly, "it is an honor to finally meet you. Michael has spoken highly of your kindness." Jane doubted this, but accepted the compliment graciously. They all sat down, and the lawyers began to extract documents from their leather portfolios. "As Mr. Ashford requested," Mr. Pemberton began, "we have prepared comprehensive documentation of all his assets and legal arrangements. I have also drafted documents that guarantee Madam Ashford full access and co-decision rights in specified matters." He extended a voluminous document. Jane accepted it, her eyes scanning the first page. The words blurred at first, legal terminology that was beyond her education. But she forced herself to focus, to understand. "I can summarize if you prefer," Mr. Walsh offered, with thinly veiled condescension that immediately raised Jane's defenses. "I can read, thank you," she replied coolly, pleased to see surprise register on his face. Perhaps he had expected an illiterate seamstress, easily impressed and controlled. Michael hid a smile. Jane received an exceptional education through the Sisters of Mercy. She reads and writes better than most. The next few hours passed in meticulous discussion of properties, investments, and financial arrangements. Jane asked questions when something wasn't clear, refusing to be rushed or patronized. Mr. Pemberton answered every query with patience, clearly impressed by her perceptiveness. Mr. Walsh became progressively more irritated. The scale of Michael's wealth left her dizzy. Properties in 3 counties, holdings in 15 different companies, investments in textile manufacturing, shipbuilding, tea import, even coal mining. The numbers were so vast they lost meaning. And these security arrangements? Jane indicated a specific section. Can you explain them in more detail? Mr. Pemberton exchanged glances with Michael, who nodded. The guards I mentioned, Michael said. There are also funds set aside to quickly relocate us if necessary, alternative identities prepared, escape routes planned. The reality of their situation struck Jane anew. This was not simple paranoia. Michael genuinely expected they might need to flee, to disappear completely. The attacks, she said slowly. How recent were they? The last one was 3 weeks ago, Mr. Walsh replied when Michael hesitated. An attempted kidnapping of young Christopher. It was thwarted by the guards, but came dangerously close to success. Jane felt the blood drain from her face. 3 weeks. Weeks after Michael had met her. Weeks before he proposed marriage. He had proceeded with the wedding, knowing the danger was immediate and real. Why didn't you tell me, she demanded, turning to Michael, if Christopher was in such recent danger? Because you would have refused, Michael replied simply. You would have refused out of justifiable fear, and I couldn't allow that. I needed you, Jane. Christopher needed you. Anger bubbled up in Jane, hot and justified. So you deceived me even more profoundly than I realized, not just about your wealth, but about active and present danger. Yes? Michael offered no excuses, made no attempt to justify. And I would do it again because the alternative was to leave my son vulnerable. Jane rose abruptly, needing distance from him, from this revelation, from this feeling of being a piece moved on a board whose rules she didn't fully comprehend. The lawyers watched uncomfortably, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Mr. Pemberton, Mr. Walsh, she said, her voice surprisingly firm, I appreciate your clarity. I would like time to review these documents thoroughly before signing anything. Certainly, madam, Mr. Pemberton replied, rising. Take all the time you need. We are at your disposal for any further questions. Michael escorted them to the door, his posture rigid with tension. When he returned, Jane was by the window, watching the long shadows of the afternoon. I'm angry, she said before he could speak. Deeply angry that you continue to deceive me even now, but I also understand. She turned to face him. If it were me, if I had a child in danger, I would have done anything to protect him too, including lying, deceiving, manipulating. Michael approached cautiously. I don't expect forgiveness. Good, because you're not forgiven. Jane crossed her arms. But Christopher needs stability, and fleeing now would only hurt him, so I will stay, but under absolutely clear conditions. No more secrets. No matter how difficult the truth, I want it. All of it. I agree, Michael said immediately, and I want to be involved in security decisions. If there's danger, I need to know how to protect Christopher and myself. I can arrange training. Then arrange it. Jane felt determination harden within her. She had married this man, assumed responsibility for his son. She would not be a passive victim waiting for others to protect her. Teach me what I need to know. Michael studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression changed. Respect, perhaps, or admiration. You are extraordinary, he said softly. Stronger than I imagined. I had to be. Jane allowed herself to relax slightly. Life offered no alternative. From the hallway, they heard sounds of Christopher waking, his sleepy voice calling for Jane. She turned towards the sound instinctively, already prepared to comfort the boy. But she paused in the doorway, looking back at Michael over her shoulder. We will build this together, she said firmly, but in truth this time. Complete, brutal honesty. Or we will build nothing. In truth, Michael agreed, and for the first time since the deception had been revealed, Jane saw genuine hope in his eyes. I promise. The following week brought a routine Jane had never imagined possible. In the mornings, While Christopher took his lessons with a discreet tutor who came 3 times a week, she met with Fletcher in the small back garden of the building. The coachman proved to be a patient but firm instructor, teaching her basic self-defense techniques that made her muscles protest in ways she had never experienced. "It's not about strength, madam," he would repeat while demonstrating how to break a wrist grip. "It's about using the attacker's momentum against himself. A woman of your build will never overcome a man in brute force, but in cunning and speed there is an advantage." Jane practiced the movements repeatedly, feeling awkward and inadequate at first, but gradually her body began to memorize the sequences: twist, turn, use the opponent's weight against them. Each session left her exhausted and with sore muscles, but also with a growing sense of capability she had never possessed. Michael sometimes watched from his office window. Jane felt his gaze on her, a constant weight that made her simultaneously self-conscious and determined to prove her commitment. If he doubted her resolve, she would demonstrate otherwise. Afternoons belonged to Christopher. The boy blossomed under her attention, the anxiety that previously marked every movement gradually diminishing. They strolled through the garden, read together, and Jane began to teach him simple stitches. His initial attempts were disastrous, the stitches wide and crooked, but he persisted with a determination that reminded her of his father. "Mama Catherine couldn't sew," he commented one afternoon, concentrating intently on holding the needle steady. "She said her hands were made for playing the pianoforte, not for practical work." Jane carefully noted the opening. Was she musically talented? Very much. She played pieces so beautiful they sometimes made me cry. Christopher looked up, his small fingers pausing in their work. "Not because I was sad, but because the music was so beautiful my chest hurt. Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," Jane assured him, gently touching his hair. "Beauty can move us deeply, even to tears." "Do you play the pianoforte?" "No, but I used to sing with my mother when I was little." Jane was surprised to share the memory. She rarely spoke of her mother, the grief of the loss still sharp, even after so many years. "She had a voice like a nightingale," the neighbors used to say. "Will you sing for me?" Christopher's eyes shone with hope. Jane hesitated, then began a simple lullaby her mother had taught her. Her voice, untrained and humble, filled the modest room. Christopher closed his eyes, leaning back against her with a sigh of contentment. When she finished, she found Michael in the doorway, an indescribable expression on his face. How long he had been standing there watching, she didn't know, but something in his gaze made her heart quicken. Evenings were more complicated. After putting Christopher to bed, Jane and Michael often found themselves in the drawing room, the physical distance between them a constant reminder of the complexities of their situation. They talked, cautiously at first, gradually discovering the contours of each other's personalities. Michael spoke of his businesses with a passion that surprised Jane. It wasn't simply about accumulating wealth, she realized. There was a genuine interest in the mechanisms of commerce, in the people he employed, in the innovations that could improve efficiency or working conditions. "My father always said that wealth without responsibility is corruption," Michael explained one evening, holding a wine glass he rarely drank from. "We employ thousands of people across the various enterprises. Their lives, their families, depend on the decisions I make. That is never something I take lightly." Jane found herself sharing, too, stories from her childhood that she rarely told anyone. Her father's death when she was 8, leaving her mother struggling to support them through needlework. The Sisters of Mercy who took her in after her mother's death, teaching her not only to read and write, but also values of compassion and dignity. "They saved me," Jane said simply. "Without their intervention, I would have ended up on the streets or worse. I owe them everything I am." "Then I owe them too," Michael replied softly, and there was something in his voice that made Jane look at him sharply. But he looked away, studying the fire in the hearth with unnecessary intensity. On the 5th evening after the lawyer's visit, Jane signed the documents that guaranteed her full access to Michael's affairs. Mr. Pemberton witnessed her signature with evident approval, while Mr. Walsh observed with thinly veiled skepticism. "Congratulations, Madam Ashford," the elder lawyer said warmly. "You have officially become one of the wealthiest women in England." The statement still seemed surreal. Jane, who had mended clothes for pennies, who had saved every shilling to pay rent, now possessed access to fortunes she couldn't even fully comprehend. It was dizzying and terrifying. But with access also came knowledge she had wished to avoid. The security reports Michael now shared revealed the full extent of the danger they faced. 3 documented attempts on Michael's life in the last year, 2 attempted kidnappings targeting Christopher, multiple extortion threats, some accompanied by violence against employees who refused to cooperate. "Who would hate you so much?" Jane asked one evening, turning the pages of the reports with trembling hands. "To do such things?" Michael stood by the window, watching the dark street below where he knew invisible guards patrolled. "Business rivals from whom I won contracts, a former partner I was forced to expose for corruption, resulting in his ruin, families who blame my companies for accidents or working conditions, some justifiably." He turned to face her. "I've built empires on the backs of others, Jane. I haven't always been gentle or fair in the process. Some of these enemies I created myself." The raw admission surprised her. "Do you regret it?" "Some decisions, yes, others no. The world of business doesn't reward gentleness or hesitation. To survive, to prosper, sometimes hard decisions must be made." He paused. "But I never imagined my son would pay the price for my ambitions." Jane saw the guilt etched into every line of his face and felt something soften within her. She rose, crossing the space between them before she could reconsider. When she touched his arm gently, he flinched, as if surprised by the contact. "Christopher is safe," she said firmly. "He has guards, he has you, he has me now too. We won't let anything happen to him." Michael covered her hand with his fingers warm and firm. "How did you become so strong? After all you faced, all the loss and hardship, how do you maintain such determination?" "Because the alternative is to give up," Jane replied simply, "and that was never an option." They stood like that for a long moment, connected through that simple touch, something unsaid yet potent growing between them. Jane was acutely aware of his closeness, the warmth emanating from his body, the way his thumb traced distracted circles on the back of her hand. The sound of footsteps in the corridor broke the moment. They separated quickly when Mrs. Dawson appeared, carrying a tea tray. "Forgive the intrusion," the housekeeper said, though her keen eyes suggested she had noticed their closeness. "I thought you might appreciate something warm before retiring." They sat apart now, the physical distance restored, but something fundamental having shifted. Jane drank her tea mechanically, aware of Michael's gaze on her, of the way the atmosphere in the room seemed charged with possibility. It was that night, lying alone in her room, that Jane finally admitted to herself what she had been avoiding recognizing. She was developing feelings for her husband, not the instant passion of the romances she used to secretly read, but something deeper and more complex. Respect for his devotion to Christopher, admiration for his intelligence and determination, and increasingly, an attraction that made her conscious of every shared glance, every accidental touch. But how could she trust these feelings when the entire foundation of their relationship had been built on deceit? Michael had chosen her deliberately, calculatingly, because she met specific needs. Was the growing affection he showed genuine, or simply gratitude for her having stayed? Jane turned restlessly in the covers, watching shadows dance on the ceiling. From the other side of the locked door connecting her room to Michael's, she occasionally heard sounds of movement. Was he also awake, wrestling with his own demons? The answer came unexpectedly the next morning. Jane came down early, planning to enjoy the quiet before the house awoke. But she found Michael already in the drawing room, still dressed in the previous day's clothes, papers scattered around him. "You didn't sleep," she observed, closing the door softly behind her. Michael looked up, and she saw exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "I couldn't. There was too much to think about." Jane approached, noticing the specific documents he was studying. They weren't business reports or security correspondences, but something more personal. Sketches of a country estate, architectural plans for a sprawling house surrounded by extensive gardens. "What is this?" "A possibility," Michael said hesitantly. "A property in Hertfordshire I've been considering. Far enough from London to offer security, but not isolated. There are lands for Christopher to explore, stables, even a small lake, I thought. He broke off, suddenly seeming uncertain in a way Jane had rarely seen him. I thought perhaps we might like a quieter life, away from the dangers of the city. Jane studied the drawings, seeing not just a property but a vision of the future, a real family living openly, without the need for constant guards or perpetual vigilance, a life that could be theirs if Michael's enemies were neutralized. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "but is it safe?" "My investigators believe they are close to identifying the primary source of the threats. Once dealt with, we could live more openly." Michael rose, standing close enough for Jane to see golden reflections in his dark eyes. "I could give you the life you deserve, Jane. Not hidden in a modest apartment, but open and honest." "And what if the investigators are wrong? If there are more enemies beyond those they've identified?" "Then we will continue as we are, vigilant, cautious, but together." He touched her face gently, and Jane instinctively leaned into the touch. "I've learned something these past few weeks. Wealth and power mean nothing without people to share them with. You and Christopher have become those people for me." Jane's heart quickened. "Michael." But whatever words she might have said were lost as Christopher came running into the room, still in his nightshirt, curls disheveled from sleep. "Jane, Papa! I dreamed we lived in a big house with horses and a lake where we could swim." Jane and Michael exchanged surprised glances, then laughed simultaneously. The synchronicity was too extraordinary to be a coincidence. "Perhaps," Michael said, scooping up his son, "we can make that dream a reality." And as Jane watched father and son together, the country estate plans spread around them like promises. She allowed herself for the first time to imagine that perhaps, just perhaps, this impossible marriage could transform into something extraordinary. The morning brought with it a thick fog that clung to the windows of their Bloomsbury apartment, transforming the familiar cityscape into something ethereal and unsettling. Jane awoke with a sense of apprehension she couldn't name, a weight in her chest that lingered even as she rose and dressed mechanically. There was something different in the air, a heavy silence that seemed to portend inevitable changes. She found Michael already dressed, standing by the drawing-room window with a rigidity that immediately set off alarms in her mind. He held a thick paper envelope, its seal already broken, and his expression was grim in a way she hadn't seen since the night she discovered his secrets. "What happened?" Jane asked, closing the door softly behind her. Michael turned, and she saw something in his eyes that chilled her. It wasn't fear exactly, but a cold determination that seemed to have hardened every line of his face overnight. "My investigators have identified the primary source of the threats," he said without preamble, extending the document to her. "And it's not who we imagined." Jane accepted the paper with hands that trembled slightly. The words blurred at first as she tried to process the detailed report. Names, dates, meticulously documented evidence, and at the heart of it all, a revelation that struck her like a physical blow. "Lady Margaret Blackwell," she read aloud, the name strange on her tongue. "Catherine's sister. The sister-in-law I never mentioned because I thought we had parted amicably after Catherine's death." Michael ran a hand through his hair, that familiar gesture of frustration. Apparently she harbored much deeper resentments than she let on. Jane continued reading, her horror growing with each line. Lady Margaret blamed Michael for her sister's death, convinced that the stress of living with a man obsessed with business and accumulating wealth had weakened Catherine until her body simply gave out. More disturbing still, she believed Christopher should be in her custody, not with the father she held responsible for making the child motherless. "She orchestrated everything," Michael said, his voice laced with bitterness. "The attacks, the kidnapping attempts, even the fires at the warehouses, all part of an elaborate plan to discredit me, financially ruin me, and eventually gain legal custody of Christopher." "But that's madness," Jane protested, feeling nausea rise in her throat. "Killing innocent people, putting a child in danger just for twisted revenge." Grief can twist even the most rational minds into something monstrous. Michael walked to the fireplace, staring at the cold ashes as if they held answers. Margaret and Catherine were close. When Catherine fell ill, Margaret was constantly by her side. She heard every groan of pain, witnessed every moment of suffering, and at some point her grief warped into hatred directed at me. Jane carefully put down the report, as if it might burn her hands. What do we do now? The investigators have gathered enough evidence to involve the authorities. Margaret will be arrested, tried for attempted murder and other crimes. Michael turned to face her, and there was something wild in his eyes now. But before that happens, I need to confront her. I need to understand how we came to this point. No. The word came out sharper than Jane intended. It's too dangerous, if she's so unstable. That's why I won't go alone. Michael approached, taking her hands with an urgency that surprised her. I need you to come with me, Jane, as my wife, as a witness. Fletcher and 2 guards will accompany us. We will be safe. Jane wanted to refuse, wanted to insist they involve the authorities immediately without risking a personal confrontation, but she saw the need in his eyes, the demand for closure that wouldn't be satisfied through impersonal legal proceedings. Michael needed to understand, needed to confront the demons that had tormented him for so long. Very well, she finally agreed, but at the first sign of danger, we leave immediately. The relief that crossed Michael's face was palpable. He pulled her into an unexpected embrace, holding her so tightly that Jane felt his heart beat against hers through the layers of clothing. Thank you, he murmured into her hair, for staying by my side even when it would be safer to flee. Jane allowed herself to absorb his warmth for a moment before gently pulling away. When do we leave? This afternoon. Margaret's residence is a 3-hour carriage ride away. The investigators have already alerted her of our visit, so it won't be a complete surprise. Michael hesitated. But Jane, you must be prepared. Margaret may say things, make accusations designed to hurt me through you. She is not stable, and her words should not be taken to heart. I can bear cruel words, Jane assured him, with more confidence than she felt. I have survived much worse. They spent the morning in careful preparations. Christopher was informed that his parents would have to travel briefly for urgent matters, but would return before nightfall. The boy accepted the explanation with visible apprehension, clinging to Jane with unusual force when she leaned down to kiss him goodbye. Will you come back? He whispered against her shoulder. Promise you'll come back? I promise, Jane replied firmly, holding him tightly. Nothing in this world would keep me from returning to you. Mrs. Dawson watched from the doorway with a grave expression. As Jane passed her, the housekeeper touched her arm briefly. Take care of him, she murmured, low enough for only Jane to hear. And of yourself. Lady Margaret was always a volatile creature, even before the tragedy. The carriage awaiting them was more robust than their usual vehicle, reinforced in ways Jane realized were meant to offer protection against attacks. Fletcher commanded the horses with a grim expression, and 2 men Jane recognized as the invisible guards who constantly patrolled accompanied them on horseback. The journey proceeded in tense silence. Michael reviewed documents repeatedly, memorizing details he must have already known by heart. Jane watched the landscape change from urban streets to rural fields, trying to calm the nerves that vibrated under her skin like overly taut violin strings. When they finally reached Lady Margaret's estate, Jane couldn't suppress a gasp of surprise. The house was smaller than she had imagined for a baroness's sister, but elegantly melancholic. Grey stone covered in ivy, tall windows with heavy curtains, gardens that had clearly once been magnificent, but now showed signs of neglect. An elderly butler received them at the door, his face carefully neutral as he led them through silent corridors to a drawing room that smelled of damp and neglect. Family portraits lined the walls, and Jane found herself searching for resemblances to Catherine in the woman who awaited them by the fireplace. Lady Margaret Blackwell was surprisingly young, perhaps 40, with blonde hair beginning to streak with grey, and eyes the same clear blue Jane had seen in Catherine's portrait. But where the sister had been delicate and ethereal, Margaret possessed a hardness that seemed etched into her bones. She was dressed entirely in black, perpetual mourning that had become an armor. Michael, she greeted him without cordiality, her voice hoarse as if from disuse. Have you brought your new wife to parade? How quickly you replaced my sister. Margaret. Michael kept his voice firm, though Jane felt tension radiating from him. You know why we are here. The investigators have been very thorough in their accusations. Margaret turned to Jane, assessing her with a gaze so intense that Jane had to force herself not to recoil. So this is the little seamstress. Catherine would have found this hilarious, you know. She who cared so much for position and proper appearances, replaced by someone who mends clothes for pennies. Jane is my wife and deserves respect, Michael said coldly. Her former circumstances are irrelevant. Irrelevant? Margaret laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Everything is irrelevant to you, isn't it, Michael? Catherine's pain as you pursued yet another fortune, her loneliness while you constantly travelled. Even her death was irrelevant, just a temporary inconvenience before you found a replacement. Jane saw Michael flinch as if struck, and something protective and fierce ignited within her. You didn't know him, she said, her voice cutting through the air. You don't know what he suffered, how Christopher suffered. You turned pain into a weapon and used it to justify monstrous acts. Margaret's eyes landed on her with new intensity. Monstrous? Protecting my nephew from a father who killed his mother through negligence is monstrous? Putting that same nephew in repeated danger through your kidnapping attempts is most certainly monstrous, Jane retorted. Christopher could have been harmed, even killed. How do you justify that as protection? For the first time, something flickered in Margaret's expression. I would never have allowed Christopher to be harmed. I gave explicit instructions. Instructions that were ignored by men you hired without proper vetting, Michael interrupted, his voice laced with contained rage. One of the would-be kidnappers was armed, Margaret, armed. If Fletcher hadn't intervened, my son could have been shot. Margaret blanched, sinking into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her. No, I told them only to scare him, to make him realize Christopher would be safer with me. Well, they failed spectacularly. Michael approached, though he maintained a respectful distance. Margaret, I know you loved Catherine. I know her death devastated you. But this... He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had transpired. This isn't love. It's a destructive obsession that has hurt innocent people and terrorized a child who has already lost too much. She was all I had, Margaret whispered, tears finally sliding down her face. Our parents died when we were young. We only had each other. And then you appeared with your promises of security and position, took her away, and she was never the same. I watched the life slowly drain from her year after year until nothing was left but an empty shell. Jane felt a reluctant compassion stir. She recognized that pain, that sense of helplessness in the face of inevitable loss. But compassion did not excuse the actions Margaret had taken. Catherine was ill, Michael said, his voice softer now. The doctors never determined exactly what, but it wasn't caused by unhappiness or neglect. Her body simply failed, and there was nothing I or you or anyone could have done to prevent it. I don't accept that. Margaret raised her eyes, defiant even through her tears. I refuse to believe she simply became ill randomly. There has to be a reason, a culprit. And you, with your obsession with business, your constant absence. I was guilty of many things, Michael admitted, surprising both Margaret and Jane. I wasn't the husband Catherine deserved. I was often absent, distracted, focused on building an empire when I should have been building a home. But I did not kill her, Margaret. And allowing this belief to consume you, to the point of destroying your own life and threatening others, is a betrayal of Catherine's memory. The silence that followed was heavy with years of unresolved pain and accusations that could never be fully answered. Jane watched them both, seeing not enemies but two people torn apart by grief, who had found destructive ways to process unbearable loss. It was Margaret who finally broke the silence. What happens now? Her voice was empty, all fight drained from her. The authorities are awaiting my signal, Michael replied. There's enough evidence to secure an arrest and trial, but... He exchanged glances with Jane, and she nodded slightly. But if you agree to seek treatment, to permanently remove yourself from me and Christopher, perhaps something can be arranged. Confinement in a private institution instead of public prison. Margaret closed her eyes, tears continuing to slide silently. I'm so tired, she whispered, so utterly exhausted from carrying this hatred. Perhaps it's time to let it go. Jane approached cautiously, kneeling beside Margaret's chair. Catherine wouldn't have wanted this for you, she said gently. Whatever happened, whatever the circumstances, she wouldn't have wanted you to destroy your life for vengeance in her name. Margaret opened her eyes, studying Jane with an expression that was almost curious. You would have liked her, you know, Catherine. She appreciated genuine kindness, and I see that in you. She raised a trembling hand, briefly touching Jane's face. Look after Christopher. Give him the love my sister could no longer offer. And perhaps look after Michael too. He needs someone, even if he'll never admit it. The journey back transpired in reflective silence. Michael had arranged everything quickly, Lady Margaret agreeing to voluntarily enter a private institution where she would receive treatment for what the doctors diplomatically called extreme nervous fatigue. No public trial would ensue, no scandal that would tarnish Catherine's name or place Christopher under unwanted scrutiny. Jane watched the landscape pass by the carriage window, processing everything she had witnessed. The woman torn apart by grief she had met today bore little resemblance to the monster she had imagined. Margaret Blackwell was simply someone who had allowed loss to consume her until nothing was left but bitterness and misdirected rage. It could have been me, Jane said softly, more to herself than to Michael. He turned to face her, confusion marking his features. What do you mean? If I had lost someone I loved so deeply, if I had witnessed their suffering without being able to alleviate it, I could have turned into something equally destructive. Jane met his gaze. The line between healthy grief and destructive obsession is finer than we like to admit. Michael reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. But you didn't turn into that. You lost your parents, faced hardships that would have broken many, and yet you maintained your kindness, your compassion. That's not weakness, Jane, it's extraordinary strength. The warmth of his hand, the sincerity in his voice, sent shivers through Jane. She was increasingly aware of his closeness, of the way his thumb traced distracted circles on her palm, of the look in his eyes that suggested something beyond gratitude or respect. Michael, she began hesitantly, when you first chose me, it was merely out of practical necessity. A mother for Christopher, someone who wouldn't ask inconvenient questions. Yes, he admitted without hesitation, initially. And now? Jane forced herself to ask the question that plagued her. Now that the danger has passed, now that Margaret no longer poses a threat, do you still need this charade of a marriage? Michael released her hand, and for a terrifying moment, Jane thought he would pull away completely. But instead, he turned to face her fully, taking both her hands with an urgency that stole her breath. It's not a charade, he said intensely. Perhaps it began as a calculated arrangement, but it has become something far more real. You have become something essential, Jane. Not just to Christopher, but to me. The way you challenge my assumptions, how you refuse to be intimidated by wealth or position, how you love my son with such genuine devotion. He paused, seeming to search for words. I'm falling in love with you. Perhaps I already have. It just took me time to recognize it. Jane's heart pounded so violently she felt dizzy. You can't just declare that, she protested weakly. Not after weeks of deception and half-truths. Then what should I do? Michael asked, raw vulnerability in his voice. Court you properly. Win your affection through romantic gestures and poetic declarations. I will do all that and more if it is what you wish, but I cannot pretend my feelings are less than they are. Jane pulled one hand free, pressing it against her chest, where she felt her own heart beating wildly. I'm afraid, she admitted, afraid to trust it, to believe it's real, only to discover later that it was merely gratitude or convenience disguised. Then don't trust words. Michael brought her free hand to his lips, kissing her fingers gently. Trust actions. Give me time to prove this is real, that you are not just convenient, but essential, that I would choose you again, not out of necessity, but out of love. The carriage slowed as it approached Bloomsbury, and Jane realized a decision needed to be made. She could continue guarding her heart, protecting herself from potential hurt through emotional distance, or she could take a risk, leap toward the possibility of true love, even knowing there were no guarantees. Very well, she finally said, her voice barely more than a whisper. but slowly. I need more time to trust completely, to believe this isn't just a reaction to a past crisis. The relief that flooded Michael's face was so intense that Jane felt something inside her chest soften even further. He pulled her into an embrace that was at once comforting and laden with unfulfilled promise. "All the time you need," he murmured against her hair. "I have the rest of my life to prove my worth." Christopher was waiting for them at the window, his small face pressed against the glass with visible anxiety. The moment the carriage stopped, he was running out the door, Mrs. Dawson following more slowly with an indulgent smile. "You're back! You're back!" The boy threw himself into Jane's arms so violently he nearly knocked her over. "I thought you might never come back." "I promised I'd come back," Jane reminded him gently, kneeling to hug him properly. "And I'll always keep my promises to you." Michael joined them, wrapping both in an embrace that made Jane feel safe in a way she had never experienced. They remained like that for a long moment, an improvised family that was gradually becoming something genuine and precious. That night, after Christopher finally fell asleep, following 3 stories and multiple reassurances that his parents wouldn't vanish during the night, Jane found herself alone with Michael in the drawing room. The fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the walls. "The plans for the estate in Hertfordshire," Jane said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Are you still considering them?" "More than considering." Michael reached for the drawings he had kept on the nearby desk. "With Margaret no longer posing a threat, we could live openly, not in constant hiding, but as a real family. Christopher could have friends, attend a proper school, run freely without constant fear. And your company, your businesses in London. They can largely be managed remotely. I will visit the city when necessary, but I will no longer live for work at the expense of family." Michael looked at her intently. "Catherine paid the price for my ambitions. I refuse to allow you or Christopher to suffer the same. So you are truly changing." Jane's wasn't a question but an admiring observation. "Choosing a different life." "Choosing different priorities," Michael corrected. "Wealth is useless if there's no one to share it with. Commercial success is hollow if it means losing those I love." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "You taught me that, Jane. Through your example, your quiet strength, your refusal to be impressed by empty show." Jane felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "When would we move?" "A month, perhaps. Enough time to arrange everything properly for Christopher to adjust to the idea." Michael hesitated. "If it is what you wish, this is your decision as much as mine." "It is what I wish," Jane confirmed, surprised by how true the statement was. The life she had imagined for herself, sewing in a small room near the docks, seemed to belong to someone else now. She had changed so much in these past few weeks, had grown in ways she never imagined possible. Michael pulled her closer until Jane found herself nestled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "There's something else I need to ask," he said hesitantly. "The door between our rooms. Will it remain locked indefinitely?" Jane felt a blush warm her cheeks. They had been married for weeks, but the marriage remained unconsummated, an uncrossed line that maintained a technical distance between them. It was an arrangement that had made sense when everything was uncertain, when Jane didn't know if she would stay or flee. "Not indefinitely," she said carefully, "but not yet. I need more time to trust completely, to know this is real." "I understand." If Michael was disappointed, he didn't show it. He merely held her more firmly, as if her closeness was enough for now. "I will wait, for as long as it takes." They sat together as the fire gradually diminished to embers, not speaking but comfortable in the shared silence. Jane allowed herself to imagine the future for the first time with genuine hope. The country estate, Christopher growing strong and happy, she and Michael building something real from the imperfect foundations of their beginning. It wouldn't be a fairy tale love story. There were too many scars, too many deceptions in the past to allow for such an illusion. But perhaps, Jane thought as she leaned against Michael's solid warmth, real stories were more valuable than fantasies. Relationships built on conscious choice and forgiveness were stronger than those based on blind passion. "Jane," Michael said softly, interrupting her thoughts. "Thank you. For what? For staying when you had every right to leave. For loving my son when you had no obligation to do so. For giving me a chance to prove I can be better than I was. He turned her gently to face him, and there was something in his eyes that stole her breath. For teaching me that true wealth isn't measured in estates or investments, but in moments like this. Jane reached for his face, touching it with a tenderness that surprised her. We are both learning, she said softly. You teach me too. A different kind of strength, the courage to protect those you love at any cost. Michael leaned in slowly, giving her ample time to pull back if she wished, but Jane remained still, heart pounding as his lips finally met hers in a kiss that was both gentle and laden with promise. It wasn't the explosion of passion from romances, but something deeper and more enduring. A commitment sealed through touch, a choice confirmed through shared vulnerability. When they finally parted, Jane rested her forehead against his, her breath uneven. 1 month, she whispered. In 1 month, when we are in the new house, when Christopher is settled and everything is in order. The door will be unlocked, Michael completed, hope and desire mingling in his voice. The door will be unlocked, Jane confirmed, and felt him tremble against her. They spent the rest of the night planning their future, low voices filling the darkened room with dreams that gradually became real possibilities. And when they finally retired to their separate chambers, Jane lay awake for a long time, listening to occasional sounds of movement through the locked door that separated them. In 1 month, that barrier would be removed. In 1 month, they would begin a new life in a new place, with no shadows of the past pursuing them. And perhaps, just perhaps, this marriage that had begun with deception and necessity would transform into something extraordinary. Jane finally fell asleep smiling, dreaming of a house surrounded by gardens where Christopher ran freely, where she and Michael walked hand in hand under an open sky, where an improvised family became true through conscious choice and hard-won love. The future, she realized in her last waking moments, seemed extraordinarily promising.